Welcome. Today we will focus on education, policy, and data sharing, all important aspects of operationalizing One Health. At UAF, we are proud of our educational programs which serve the needs of Alaska and the Arctic. We're an international leader in Indigenous studies and language. We're helping shape and understand Arctic policy through our Center for Arctic Policy Studies. Our new One Health Masters program teaches students on how to understand and manage One Health problems through a holistic and community based approach to integrating Indigenous and Western ways of knowing at the interface of human, animal, and environmental health. Our research institutes and programs work with scientists around the globe to better understand the pressing issues facing the Arctic and that have been covered in this conference, such as holistic health and well being, zoonotic diseases, food security, security and sovereignty, and climate change. Sharing information and building collaborations is one of the main goals of this conference and significantly strengthens all our research and educational programs. We are so pleased to welcome you to UAF and to day 5 of the One Health, One Future conference and hope this is the beginning of many, many long and fruitful relationships.
Welcome to day 5 of our 2021 One Health, One Future conference. Today, our emphasis is going to be on education, policy, and data sharing, important ways of operationalizing One Health. And I would like to recognize 2 individuals who have been incredibly generous in supporting the educational side of One Health at UAF, Ms. Marilyn Russell and Ms. Sue Carlton. Through their generous support, we've been able to offer this education to several of our students from rural and Indigenous communities. Our first speaker today is Dr. Jessica Black. Dr. Black is Gwich'in from the village of Gwich'yazi, also known as Fort Yukon, and Togohotali, also known as Nenana, both in Alaska. Dr. Black currently serves as an assistant professor in the Department of Alaska Native Studies, Rural Development, and Tribal Governance at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Dr. Black received her bachelor's degree in social work at UAF and her master's degree and PhD in social work at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. Her dissertation and current research examine the relationship between governance and well-being among Alaska Native peoples, especially as it pertains to tribal stewardship and cultural connectivity. She resides in Fairbanks with her family. However, she frequently returns to her home to Gwich'in to hunt, fish, gather, and engage in other important cultural practices. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Black. After Dr. Black speaks, Martin Halver Hoved will speak, followed by Pips Feasy, followed by Amy Lauren Lovecraft, and then Ellen Chenoweth. So please welcome our speakers, and remember that we'll have a plenary panel afterwards to ask questions, and then a break for some networking, and then poster sessions. I hope you enjoy this 5th day of our One Health, One Future conference. Thank you.
Bangwinzi, Shojri Jessica Blackoji, Gwichaje Gwatsan Ethli, Gatanan Gwichi, Shahan Marlene, Shiti Bill, Shitziza Shitzu, Sarah Isaac John, Gwichaje Gwatsan Hisha, Shoote Danny, Shichu Aurora. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jessica Black, and my family's from Fort Yukon. My mother is Marlene and my father is Bill, and my grandparents are the late Sarah and Isaac John of Fort Yukon. And my partner Danny Lee, who is from Arctic Village, and I have a little girl named Aurora. I'd like to thank the One Health leadership team and conference planning team for inviting me to give one of the keynotes this week. The title of my talk is Paddling Our Own Canoes, Intersections of Alaska Native Governance, Wellbeing, and Health. I'd first like to start by offering a traditional land acknowledgement. I am honored to live and work on the traditional homelands of the Lower Tanana Dene, who have stewarded these lands for 10,000 plus years. And I feel very honored to work on the Trothiadet campus. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Alaska Native Studies and Rural Development, and also tribal governance. I wanted to share with you some pictures of my family and some of the activities that we have engage in presently and are teaching our children. I come from a very large extended family. The picture in the top middle is of my great grandmother, the late Julia Peter, who had a lot of children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, was a traditional medicine person, very knowledgeable about plants. She also was a midwife and helped deliver over 100 babies in her lifetime. And I'm just very grateful for her and the other women in my life who have helped pave the way in many respects so that I could, one, be here today and also do some of the work that I'm so passionate about doing. The other pictures are pictures of my family and I out at fish camp, or out on the land harvesting blueberries, sharing with our great aunts so that they can share with our babies. And so these pictures really reflect the deep sense of connection that I have and feel for my family, but also the land, which has nourished and sustained me my whole life. And so I would like to also say Masit Cho to the land for helping to raise me and shape me into the person I am today. I actually want to go back for a second, and I want to talk about just one more thing, and that is when I actually look back on my life and all of the experiences that I've had, I can't actually think of a point in time where the land and animals were not a critical part of my life. When I'm flying home into my village of Fort Yukon, I feel I'm instantly filled with a sense of peace, connection, and spiritual fulfillment just looking at the Yukon River. And the only explanation is that I'm rooted to the land, to my ancestors. You know, my DNA comes from this place. And so that deep connection and that interdependence of people, environment, animals is really what One Health is all about. In fact, in the definition on the One Health website, it says One Health is the interdependence of human, animal, and environmental health and a holistic approach to well-being. And so the first thing that pops into my mind when I think about One Health is, yes, that's just the way things are. As an Indigenous person born and raised out on the land within our environments, which include, you know, water, plants, animals, this interdependence is how I came to know the world, how I became a human being in my culture, right? So thinking about this interdependence, it feels very natural to me, the One Health paradigm, but it's more than interdependence to me. When I'm thinking about my relationship with the water or the land or the animals, I feel a deep sense of connection to my creator. And so it's a sacred spiritual relationship. And I just wanted to share that because I think from the Indigenous worldview, this One Health paradigm feels very natural because it's the way that many Indigenous cultures have always thought. But it's wonderful that within Western academia, that this relationship is given voice and a center to study these relationships as they exist. I wanted to also say that as an Indigenous person who spends a lot of my academic life studying the relationships between governance and well-being, especially as it pertains to natural resource management, that Indigenous people or Alaska Native peoples have been here in Alaska for thousands of years, 14,000 plus years. And there has not only been this presence, but this ongoing stewardship and care. And we knew this as Indigenous people, we know this because we are passed down stories from our elders and our cultural teachers about how our people survived because the land took care of them, or how they were able to share with other people who might have entered a period of starvation because the land provided. So we know that we've existed here a very long time. We also, the land has remained very pristine in many ways. And that was always within our values, is the care and provision for the land. So we know this to be true. But also within Western academic circles, there's been a lot of light shed on the existence of Indigenous people in Alaska. In the Tanana River Basin, the remains of a young child was found that was 11,500 years old. There was also some Venetian trade beads that were found in the Brooks Range that proved that there were extensive trading routes among Indigenous people that predated Columbus. So within both Indigenous science or Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science knowledge systems, there is this affirmation that Indigenous people were indeed here on these homelands for thousands of years, and there was ongoing stewardship and care. And at the more global level, a World Bank report, I'm sure many have heard this, but in 2008, there was a report called The Role of Indigenous Peoples in Biodiversity Conservation. And it talked about how while Indigenous people only made up 4% of the global population, their traditional territories encompass up to 22% of the world's land surface. And that coincides with 80% of the planet's biodiversity. So not only are we here, but we're always been living in deep connection of land and place and carrying or stewarding the land as in a relational way. And this ongoing stewardship and these deep connections exist today. As you can see from these pictures, these come from my family. And while much has changed since the first arrival of non-native people to Alaska, we're still here as Indigenous people, although we've experienced really immense change. And I have to just give voice to that. In the 1700s, we had the arrival of Russian people to our shores, and they did enslave the Unangan people so that they could hunt fur seals and other fur-bearing animals. We had the Spanish flu of 1918, where 1 out of every 20 people in Alaska died, and 80% of those who died were Alaska Native people. And then we also have elders in our living time who experienced the really horrific boarding school experience where Alaska Native elders were taken away to boarding school, and they were oftentimes far from home, and they had to essentially give up any piece of their culture and assimilate into mainstream culture. A lot of abuse occurred, and those elders are still healing from the wounds that were inflicted upon them. And so while these accounts of history are really painful to hear, it's really essential that we share this history from our perspectives as Alaska Native people, because so much of the time these stories are told for us, and they're usually watered down versions that don't really depict the situation as it occurred, or the sheer trauma that was experienced and is ongoing yet today, or the tremendous strength it took to just make it through these experiences and not only survive, but really thrive. A major component of health, human health, is understanding the history of people in the areas in which you live, but not only, you know, the history of peoples all over the world, but Alaska is an indigenous place. And so we must tell this history and utilize that information to help us move forward in a really powerful way, given that knowledge. The story's truly still being written, because despite these immense hardships that we endured as Alaska Native people, we're still here. And yes, we carry some of the scars of those traumas, but both historic and more recently. But we continue to move forward. And a lot of the ways that we do that is through the exercising of our values, which is out on the land in connection with environment and place, in accordance with our values. And I would say that the land really helps to heal us as we deal with these individual and collective experiences. And in return, we do everything we can to care and provide for the land through our Indigenous stewardship. And our values, again, are really central. Guided by our values, that is true traditional governance. You know, and how you learn your values and you practice them is out in your environment. For example, when you are, you harvest an animal or you're gifted an animal, the animal gifts itself to you, you share everything with your whole community and your family, and you give everything away. And that's just really about care and provision for the family, respect for elders and others, village cooperation and responsibility to village. So really, these values not only shape who we are, but they teach us how to be human beings. And we learn that from being out in one's environment and in relationship with like the animals, the water, the plants. And so today, you know, we're also a global world. I mean, I'm here on Zoom giving a presentation. Maybe there's people from different parts of the world out there. And Indigenous people the world over are actively engaged in stewardship and living in relationship with the land, whether it's implementing programs such as this two-eyed seeing approach at the University of British Columbia, which really draws from Indigenous knowledge and Western science to develop the best tools for helping fisheries and communities, to the Yasuni and Sapara people of South America. They reside at the intersection between the Andean uplands and the Amazonian lowlands, and they have stewarded their homelands for thousands of years. And because of such, they've really ensured this rich biodiversity that we as scientists still don't know fully about because there's just so much complexity there. Yet the Sapara and Yasuni people experience many of the challenges that accompany things like development and overpopulation, colonization, a changing climate, to the Carrizo Comecrudo tribe of Texas, who live at the border of the US and Mexico. And as they put it, they are in the path of the wall. And they are also threatened daily by a potential natural liquefied gas line that's going through some of their sacred territory. And they're working very hard to protect some of those sacred sites, such as the Garcia Pasture, which is in the Rio Grande Valley and has a lot of the remains and cultural artifacts from their people. And they are trying to find their voice and advocate to protect their homelands despite not having federal recognition. So You know, there's examples of Indigenous stewardship and Indigenous advocacy, Indigenous sovereignty in action the world over. One only needs to look for them. And these holistic relationships, humans, animals, environments, this interconnection or interdependence that exists really helps to achieve well-being for Indigenous people. My dissertation work was looking at the relationship between governance and well-being in the Yukon Flats, especially as it pertained to natural resources management. And one of the questions that I asked my participants was, is hunting, fishing, gathering associated with well-being? And one of the quotes was, yes, it is, because it is our way of life for, 10,000 years. No exceptions. It just is. Another response I got is, oh, yes, the ability to hunt, fish, gather, it helps too. It helps the land. In order for you got to know how the land is or how the environment is in order to know what's healthy and what's not. We respect the cycle of life. And my dad, he just knows when it's good for trapping by just looking at the land. And if he knows it's over trapped, he won't go and kill the last of it. He'll go somewhere else that might be more healthy. So it's just the way you balance that life. And so these quotes really embedded with them are these nuances that really speak to this long-term connection that exists. And when we're thinking, we as Indigenous people are thinking of One Health or this interconnection, it's very hard to step outside it and actually look at it and say, yes, that exists, because it's so much of just the way we are, because we've been so intimately connected with the land and place for so long. And the knowledge of, say, my great grandmother, who you saw in the picture, that's passed down to my grandmother, that's passed to my mother and to me, that knowledge is accumulative. And so there's thousands of years of knowledge embedded within Indigenous peoples and families and communities. So what is the problem? I've just shared with you the deep sense of interconnection that Indigenous people feel with environment, with animals, this One Health paradigm. What is the problem, essentially? Well, the rights to the lands, territories, and resources are at the heart of Indigenous people struggles around the world. Take Alaska, for example. We have a very complex land system here. The way land was settled was very different than many parts of the world. A lot of the Indigenous land holdings in Alaska are in the hands of Alaska Native corporations, whereas tribally owned lands are much less. And this really makes a complex and precarious situation as far as how Alaska Natives are able to steward or manage their lands. The Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which passed in 1971, again placed a lot of Indigenous lands into the hands of Alaska Native corporations, and those lands are managed by the state of Alaska. However, there was an agreement made that eventually this Aboriginal rights to hunting and fishing would be settled, but that didn't actually happen till 1980 with the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, ANILCA, Title 8 of ANILCA. And the act placed over 104 million acres of Alaska land into national parks, preserves, refuges, monuments, wilderness, and wild and scenic river areas. But there contained a provision in Title 8 to give rural Alaskans a subsistence user priority on federal lands and waters. The law really fell short of providing for the traditional and customary needs of Alaska Native peoples. And so it makes it very hard to fully actualize this sense of interconnectedness between environment, between animals and humans as it relates to Alaska Native people. Conservation programs, which are often lauded for doing a lot of good work and keeping our environment pristine and protecting animals, they have at times excluded human beings, including Indigenous peoples, from environmental and natural resources stewardship. And this has had really negative consequences on the rights of Indigenous peoples and failed to recognize their natural custodianship that they've always had with the environment and ecosystem. And so I know that things are changing, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but you know, that can be a problem if Indigenous people aren't equitably included in these conversations around conservation, because value-wise, you know, we've always been very conservation driven, but we also know that living in relationship with the land, animals, plants, and waters, that there's this reciprocal giving that occurs. And to be a good relative, you know, you want to adhere to those basic values and principles that are so embedded within our cultural norms. Another problem is a lot of research that focuses on environment, animals, and humans is very siloed. So we stay in our respective areas and we don't really talk outside of them. And that is hard because we know our systems are really complex, right? You know, our fish swim in the water, and not just humans eat fish, but a lot of the mammals that live in the ocean, and the environment really impacts the ocean, which impacts the fish. So we have to be able to think about moving beyond these silos to more holistic approaches. And then in Alaska, you know, we are in this unique position because we have over 200 federally recognized tribes who have, again, stewarded the land for 10,000 years, but there is little recognition of that. And because of the way that Indigenous land settlement happened, we have less say in the governing structures that manage our traditional homelands. And that is really unfortunate, because when we're not involved in issues that intimately impact us, such as the health of animals, environment, and waters, it's not only an affront to our tribal sovereignty, but to the detriment of the system overall. We live in such close spiritual relationship to the land, animals, and waters. We, you know, we're on our lands daily. Our very survival depends on the health of the environment and the animals, that we know a lot, and we could provide a lot of information that would increase the overall health and well-being of the environment and the animals. So involvement of Indigenous peoples in accompanying worldviews could be utilized to help understand some of the most vexing problems that impede a One Health paradigm. But we can't stay stuck in the problems. Yes, we have to recognize them for what they are, but we also need to be moving towards solutions. And that's where I see the One Health paradigm being really instrumental, is that, you know, because of this One Health paradigm being elevated in research and science, it can really help us to transition into cutting edge solutions in this more collective manner, which I'll talk about here in a second. So how do we get there? One way we can get there is through the recognition of Indigenous peoples, tribal sovereignty, and the long-term stewardship that Indigenous people have engaged in for millennia. We can also recognize the multiple ways of knowing, or the pluralism of worldviews, including Indigenous knowledge. How do we do that? We have to make space to do that. Things like this conference, where we hear from different scholars, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, from a whole array of disciplines, but coming together to share and to learn from each other. I also am a big proponent of learning in place. Like I shared in my beginning slides, I was raised out on the land, and I not only learned from my family and the animals, but the environment overall. There's just something that can be said about being in nature, and that nature has so much to teach us. We get there by engaging in true community-based participatory research. A lot of research in the past or historically has harmed Indigenous communities or failed to invite them as equitable partners in the process of gathering data. And that's to the detriment of the research. True community-based participatory research, there is an equitable relationship between communities and the researchers, and they are not only generating questions collectively, engaging in data collection, analyzing, but they're also addressing power imbalances that exist between, Western academia and the communities that they work with, and addressing those power imbalances through the process of research. And then breaking down the silos that exist. It's hard to address problems when we're looking at them through disparate lenses. We need to bring people together and, again, dismantle these power imbalances and use approaches that ensure equitable opportunities for different ways of knowing to emerge. So that may not just be in a conference, right? It may, again, be situated in place through experiences out on the land, or through cultural ceremonies, if invited, through teaching young people the skills they need, Indigenous young people the skills they need to become full adults, so rites of passage. So those ways of coming together and opportunities to learn and cross-learn, they can be really diverse, and we just need to be open to engaging in that type of learning. I wanted to talk a little bit about the recognition of tribal sovereignty. In Alaska, there's over 220 federally recognized tribes, and these tribes, my tribe, have inherent sovereignty, so sovereignty that has always existed. And the tribes in Alaska are doing some really amazing things for the benefit of their tribal citizens, yes, but a lot of what they do benefits everyone. And one example is the COVID vaccination efforts. Tribes were really at the forefront of ensuring that the COVID-19 vaccinations rolled out in not only a rapid but safe manner. And Alaska Native Tribal healthcare entities not only vaccinated their own tribal population, but made the vaccinations available to all Alaskans prior to the governor even declaring everyone in the state was eligible for a vaccination. And while we're sovereign, meaning we have a government-to-government relationship with the US government, we're still seeking to achieve that same recognition by the state of Alaska, because one, it's the right thing to do, and two, it would go a long ways to bettering the relationship that we have with the state of Alaska and the governing of our tribal territories. So Alaska tribes have been asserting their sovereignty in many different ways, and the outcomes have been really positive. I also wanted to just briefly touch upon this pluralism of worldviews that I spoke about in my previous slide in regards to including Indigenous knowledge as its own intact knowledge system, because Indigenous knowledge is really about the multiplicity of knowledge, or knowing a little about many subjects, the dynamic energy and spirit of all things, non-linearity and cyclical nature of time and wholeness, and common sense values of sharing, cooperation, and stewardship and equity. Whereas in the Western worldview, you have an emphasis on knowledge specialization, time as more linear, measurable quantity or descriptor, separation of nature and culture, and more about disconnection and reductionism, marginalization or erasure of relationality, energy, and spirit or wholeness, and then the common sense values of efficiency, competition, conservation, and equality. And my point in naming these things and sort of bringing them to the forefront is that these two different worldviews, they exist, and people tend to act in research, in work, in daily life based on their worldview. But when we bring these two worldviews together as their own in technology systems, we have to understand them for what they are so that we can utilize them in the best way possible. And I wanted to just draw your attention to this beautiful painting by Ahtna artist Zach Martin, who really depicts well-being from this Indigenous worldview. And I just thought it was so beautiful. I wanted to add it here. I want to kind of shift the rest of my time to talking about some of the contemporary examples of One Health in action. I'm going to give a couple of examples from some of the research that I'm engaged in, and then one from a more national context. So the first project that I'm part of is the Indigenizing Salmon Science and Management project. It's a project funded by the National Science Foundation that documents the breadth and depth of Indigenous values, knowledge, and governance systems connected to salmon across Alaska, and using this wisdom to improve current salmon science and management processes for all. The methodologies that we engage in are very Indigenous focused. We have circle dialogues, which are similar to a talking circle, but with we engage in more racial equity circle dialogues where we center our talk around a certain issue and invite people with different viewpoints to the circle. And we also engage in multi-generational interviews. So we might have a grandparent, a parent, and a grandchild all in an interview talking about salmon science and management and feeding off each other during the interview, learning from each other, and then cultural exchange and deep learning. So we're really thinking about, if you will, this One Health approach and that intersection of environment, animals, and humans. We also are very much engaged in the process of how we do research. So we're thinking back historically how research was conducted with Indigenous people or on Indigenous people. Instead, we're looking at more community-based participatory research where we're in relationship with community. The research is Indigenous-led. We're building and strengthening ethical relationships, connecting our work to local priorities and ongoing work. So we're not reinventing the wheel, but we're actually engaging in these really deep and trusting relationships with our partners. And then we're also training Indigenous students and partners who are doing the work in their home region, because again, you know, it just makes sense to work with people who already know their environment, they know the language, they know the land, and build a trusting relationship where they're leading the work and we're actually taking their lead in how to go about more Indigenous approaches to the research. The other project is Damamta, meaning all of us in the Sugpiaq language. And the goals of this project are to provide this supportive program. It's NSF NRT, which is a graduate research research traineeship, and we are providing a program for the next generation of Indigenous and allied scientists and managers. And part of it is engaging in decolonizing and indigenizing approaches widely across UAF and our partnerships. How are we going to do that? Well, this coming fall, 2021, we have our first group of Tamamta scholars, and they will be proceeding through their graduate education in fisheries together. And they'll be engaging in fall retreats, in Indigenous Fisheries of Alaska class. We're really trying to integrate art and representation like the painting by Zach Martin to reflect the holistic nature of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous stewardship, fish camp and cultural immersions, elders and residents, visiting Indigenous scholars, racial equity dialogues, and short courses and trainings for our partners. I also wanted to draw your attention. I'm sure you all are familiar with the two-eyed seeing approach, which is this Indigenous framework to transform fisheries research and management. Andrea Reed, who is a citizen of the Nisga'a Nation, helped launch the Center for Indigenous Fisheries at the University of BC. And just incredible work coming out of there, including the two-eyed seeing approach, which is really about learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and the other eye with the strengths of mainstream or Western knowledge and ways of knowing, and using both eyes together for the benefit of all. And she credits Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall for really talking and sharing about his knowledge of the two-eyed seeing approach. And what I really love about this is that it's really about, okay, we have one eye, from our one eye, we are seeing the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and the other eye, Western knowledge and ways of knowing. But then we're going to take what we know and move forward in action to create more equity, to use the best community-based approaches and prioritize the needs and voices of Indigenous people in our research, in our outreach. And so out of the work, they talk about at its core, it's really about these key principles, our values of respect, responsibility, reciprocity, relationality, and building on those values to move forward in research in a very respectful way. So if you haven't read this paper, it really is amazing, and the work coming out of the Center for Indigenous Fisheries is really amazing. So in closing, I wanted to posit this question: One Health, is it possible? And for me, I say, of course, because it's already been, like I said, as an Indigenous person, I know this to be true from the stories of my elders, from the pristine health of our lands, animals, waters. However, we must push the boundaries because the status quo is not working. We are seeing, rapid climate change. We're seeing a decline in our Chinook salmon populations. We're seeing, our watersheds really changing, some of our creek beds drying up. We're seeing just a lot of changes that are very concerning to us as people who love this land. But we have to go forth in a way that looks to the original stewards of this land, the Indigenous people, to help restore this balance between the environment, the animals, and people. 10,000 plus years of healthy coexistence based on the values of respect, reciprocity, and relationality. To me, that's very much evidence-based research. And yes, we need to bring forth the best of Western science and the best of Indigenous knowledge and use this two-eyed seeing approach to really move forward and confront these challenges head on. But this will require us as researchers, as scientists, to move beyond our respective silos and come together and look at our problems in a very holistic way. And this can occur through many different ways, gathering and sharing in spaces like the One Health Conference or out at Fish Camp, engaging in really real conversations about racial equity. Multi-generational interviews with Indigenous knowledge experts and their families, and story work as well. But in order for the One Health paradigm to be achieved, it's going to take all of us, Damamta, all of us. Is it possible? I believe it is. And I'm excited for what the future holds. So in closing, I just want to say thank you very much for listening to me this morning. And I hope you all have a great rest of the conference. Take care, everyone.
Hi, my name is Marit Honere Håveid. I'm from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, Norway. I'm a professor of education, and here with me is also my colleague in Haspen.
Hi, I'm Halvor Håveid, and I'm also a professor of education.
And today we're going to speak about sustainable knowledge, making education meaningful for the next generation. What counts as knowledge for students in education? The role education can play in terms of developing a sustainable future has to take into account what counts as knowledge for students. Making education meaningful requires that the knowledge students work with also makes sense for them in their local contexts. This talk will address some epistemological questions in relation to knowledge in education and exemplify with a project that has been developed in math education among Sami students in Finnmark, Norway. We argue that various knowledge forms cannot be ignored in a One Health approach to education. So, what counts as knowledge in education? We read One Health as a holistic approach. Our argument about education shows that this holistic approach must be bottom-up. This is what is stated in these three statements. Students need to experience that the knowledge they study makes sense for them in their context, meaning it is reflexive. Sustainable education must preserve and develop the I can of every student. Knowledge in use must count in education. The position we talk from as educators develops a critique of education in the Western world, which, we argue, is a type of education that doesn't or will not serve the aims of One Health. Our critique asks, what is sustainable knowledge for students in his or her local environment? The approach to knowledge in education today doesn't ask this question. Rather, it is driven by an idea that students must learn abstract, universal knowledge. This is, for instance, the kind of knowledge driven by testing systems, especially high-stakes testing. In this presentation, we'll use mathematics as an example. The reason for this is that mathematics has become a driver for the development of education worldwide. Driving education towards a more abstract understanding of knowledge with reference to a type of knowledge that is detached from experiencing.
You know when you know. This expression is significant for knowledge in use. or practical knowledge. In education, in teaching and learning processes in school, the knowledge that is presented for students to learn is abstract, and it often fails to connect with every student's experience. The teacher may tell the student that his answer was right, but the student was not capable of using this school knowledge in his own living. To learn means one needs to experience that one has learned, that one knows, comprehends, and master something. Think of learning how to bicycle. When you were young and learned to bicycle, then you practiced, probably failed, and practiced more, and eventually you knew how to bicycle. You had learned it. Then, just as a thought experiment, let us say that you were not given a bike to practice, but instead you were placed in front of a desk and had to study traffic rules and the technical details of the bicycle. After a period of study, you received an A on the bicycle test. But the question is, do you know how to bicycle? The kind of knowledge we refer to in education is the knowledge which always has reference to experiences. Even if the content knowledge is abstract in education, some relations need to be created to students' experiences. One can call this practical knowledge. This kind of knowledge has permanence, and you know you have acquired the knowledge. You know when you know. You know how to bicycle. In other words, this kind of knowledge is always situated.
To be sustainable knowledge in education, learning must connect with students' experiences in a wide sense to be effective. If it fails to connect, and does so over longer periods, students will fail to, or cease to engage with the knowledge taught. Let's give an example. Most of us learned numbers as children when we were playing. Whether you played hide and seek or board games, counting was a main reference for the participating in the game. Counting in hide and seek is a measure of time. It's a measure of the time the participants have to go hide themselves. When you play a board game, you count and move your players according to the number on the dice. The eyes on the dice say how far your player can move on the board. Counting them represents a measure of distance in space. Counting in these two cases represent a measure of length of time and of distance in space. Both are forms of understandings developed through bodily experiences. One reason some teachers of mathematics do not speak of counting, but instead of numbers, is that they want to detach the understanding of numbers from these bodily experiences of counting. If the idea is to learn the pure logic of mathematics, then numbers are ideal, since they do not refer to a reality, to students' bodily experiences. In this example, we have tried to show a challenge in education, and consequently in education for sustainable knowledge. For humans to learn and understand, and to apply what they have learned, the knowledge must relate to their experiences in some way or other. We argue the more detached knowledge in education becomes, the less likely it is to create sustainable knowledge.
Ethnomathematics is a practical approach to mathematics. Mathematics exists in natural languages, and there are 6 mathematical activities recognized in all cultures. These activities are counting, locating, measuring, designing, playing, and explaining. The ethno-mathematical approach, referring mathematics to mathematical activities, is different from the abstract language of mathematics commonly taught in school in Western nation-states. Here, most schools teach mathematics as a universal system of logic, which belongs to an ideal and universal science system of mathematics. An ethno-mathematical approach is different. It relates mathematics to the activities in a local culture. For example, some Sami schools teach mathematics by building on students' everyday practices. This means they engage students in activities that are practical. For instance, they take the pattern in Sami costumes and use it for activities related to ethno-mathematical activities. Furthermore, using the costumes as a reference for mathematics is also related to students acquiring their own costumes as 15-year-olds for their confirmation. So using the costumes in mathematics is not only about learning the subject, but also a way of engaging students in processes related to their own culture and their own identity. The content in the mathematical activity relates to themselves.
There is a relation between curiosity, experience, and learning. To spark curiosity towards knowledge is a very different understanding of knowledge in education. To teach experience-based, as with ethnomathematics, what does this require of the teacher or of education in general? Let us address what is required in the classroom, in the meeting between teacher and students. Here we use the didactical triangle to explain. The triangle is a model of the various relations present in teaching and learning. The arrows in the model point to the various relations between the teacher, the student or students, and the content or the subject matter. In classroom teaching, teachers must be aware of or take into account both his or her own relation to the content and the student's relation to the content. If a teacher is only concerned with his or her own relation to the subject matter, then the teacher is often mainly concerned with teaching what is required by the curriculum. The teacher's concern is then to get through the textbook or to convey the knowledge she or he, as the teacher, has acquired. This is very different from a teacher who understands that knowledge needs to build on students' experiences. A teacher must then be able to start activities that make students curious and become engaged, that inspire them to inquire and seek knowledge, to know more and better. What we argue is, the teacher needs to be less concerned with his or her own knowledge and more preoccupied with what students already know, what they have experienced. This is how teaching needs to build students' curiosity. What is sustainable knowledge? We argue that it is sustainable if it sparks curiosity, if it celebrates what students know and learn, if everyone experience I can. Sustainable knowledge is effective when it is shared by everyone. Our conclusion for building sustainable knowledge in education is that the outcome, if we need to speak about learning outcome, is less about what is measurable and more about what makes a student acknowledge what she or he knows. Education should celebrate what students know, a Fairbanks teacher once told us. This is true. If education did so, every student would also know that they are capable, like when someone knows how to bicycle.
Hello, and welcome to the One Health session on data management. I'm going to talk about how we might prepare to manage the data from this large and distributed effort of circumpolar One Health research. My name is Pip Spizzi, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks and a project director for the Alaska Established Program to Stimulate Competitive Research. So for the past 15 years, I've been leading working with the EPSCoR project, now as the leader. We are currently looking at the changes taking place in Alaska through a project called Fire and Ice. I've also worked as an oceanographer and spent time in both Alaska and Antarctica drilling ice cores. My research focuses on team science, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that and make the connection between team science and data management for One Health. I also spent some time on the Exxon Valdez during the oil spill in Prince William Sound. And all of these things are really these team efforts the efforts that grew out of these were really significant around data collection and management, and I think really apropos for the conversation that we're having today around One Health data management. So at the Alaska Established Program to Stimulate Competitive Research that is funded by the National Science Foundation with support from the state of Alaska, we seek to build Alaska's research infrastructure to improve our capacity to do both basic research and disseminate that research for the benefits of Alaskans. So this integrated and interdisciplinary project has many overlaps with One Health topics that we've been discussing this week. We're looking at drivers of high latitude ecological change, and the vision of the project was to improve the understanding of the drivers, processes, and consequences of ecological change in northern ecosystems. We're working across Alaska and really looking at boreal fires and coastal margins and the changes that are happening in both of those places. We also have integrated education outreach and stakeholder engagement, and try to focus on the co-production of knowledge with our community partners. And then in terms of impacts, we are developing new and informed resources for management, education, and diverse STEM workforce development activities, and trying to increase the research competitiveness of Alaska. So through doing a number of these projects from Antarctica to Alaska and Greenland, I was part of a team of scientists, and many of those examples required large teams of scientists. And when I started working with EPSCoR, there was this pull and kind of this newer initiative by the National Research Council to think about what team science was. They were just starting to kind of pull together a bunch of experts and put out this publication called Enhancing the Effectiveness of Team Science. And it was really kind of trying to develop the translational applications to help maximize the efficiency and the effectiveness of team science, and how team science could really step into the research arena. So it has its roots at the National Institutes of Health. The first conference was in 2006, and we've had annual conferences starting in 2010 that go on today. So this was kind of the first effort to bring together and develop consensus about what team science actually is. So one of the reasons that we care about team science is that society's problems don't neatly fit into how the university is typically organized. The Academy has historically been divided into disciplinary departments with their own distinct languages and cultures and methodologies and theoretical approaches. So problems don't come packaged into these neat little disciplinary units. The research today requires this transdisciplinary approach, or the convergence approach that National Science Foundation is talking about today, that bring together the best of multiple disciplines to address these wicked and societal problems. So One Health is a great example of an approach that requires teams with deep disciplinarians, but also integrative thinkers and boundary spanners who can help synthesize information and support teams. So just as some quick background, this was a foundational study done in 2007 that shows that collaborative science is increasing, and that trend continues today. The percentage of science that is conducted by teams of 2 or more and the mean size of teams are increasing. So today, 90% of work in science and engineering disciplines is being done in teams. Over the past decade, funding agencies have really taken an interest in this and looked into the science and team science to inform funding opportunities. Today, one of the big 10 ideas at NSF is that of convergence, as I mentioned earlier. And NSF talks about convergence research as a means of solving vexing research problems, in particular complex problems focusing on societal need. And it entails integrating knowledge and methods and expertise from different disciplines and forming novel frameworks to catalyze scientific discovery and innovation. So the end results for each solution will vary, but the goal is this long-lasting societal impact. And this is just another way to kind of, another signal that team science is becoming more and more prevalent. These are trends in authorships. The science and engineering teams and larger groups, as reflected in publications, have consistently expanded in size over the past 5 decades. So this trend is shown in the frequency of papers published each year by single authors, and then groups of various sizes from 1960 to 2013. The total number of publications you can see increasing over time for each one of those groups, but the number of those written by teams is increasing faster. So there can be significant challenges to team science or significant benefits to team science, but there are also some significant challenges that we have to keep in mind. So if we just take a moment to look at some of the various features of science teams and think about One Health project specifically, we see that many types of challenges that we need to address as we develop teams to work on the various issues, and thinking about data management in the terms of some of these complexities, I think can be helpful, especially kind of as we're starting to spin up teams and bring people together. So you can see that these key features have this range of the spectrum that travels from low complexity to high complexity for each one of the features. So obviously small teams that don't have a lot of task interdependence, with people just working in groups of maybe 2 or 3 and maybe doing their own thing to compile information, and don't have fluid boundaries, so the teams remain the same over time, and they're all kind of working on maybe one project for their entire, time period, and that maybe they're more disciplinary in nature or unidisciplinary in nature. Maybe they're all biologists or bird biologists or veterinarians working on a particular disease. And if they are less diverse and if they are located together, those are all teams that have lower complexities and maybe fewer features that we need to think about as we're bringing together teams and thinking about how data management and leadership is going to work in these cases. So my research was looking at leading and managing team science. There were 5 different groups of concepts that the experts that I worked with decided were important. Working from the bottom, communication, as you can imagine, is important. Social competence, relationship management, and social awareness. These are important things for leaders to know, as are the personal competences of leaders, how you manage the team, how you manage yourself, your own self-awareness, Shared leadership is a common topic that comes up with teams these days, because in the larger teams, there's so much to know and to do that sharing the leadership roles is really important. But then we come to the top in project management, which is another kind of really obvious element of leading teams. And I think data management fits squarely under that idea of project management, and being able to manage a project well and be prepared ahead of time for the data needs that you're going to have can really help a team get off on good footing. So over the years, over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been working with teams across the country to develop collaboration plans that can help teams think about the different areas that they're going to grapple with. And having these explicit conversations at the start of a project can be really helpful to lay out and help develop a common understanding of how the project's going to work. So this can really help establish and promote trust, especially at the beginning of a project. And there's risk in hoping or assuming that there will be agreement on all of these topics as the team develops. So this explicit conversation and stating the expectations for everyone on the team is really an important thing to do, especially around data, so people understand when and where and how they can access shared data. So there are some resources, some good resources for thinking about team science and tools that can be helpful, especially at the beginning of a project, to say this is a really nice way of bringing people together and developing your team through an opportunity to kind of reflect and think about how you want the team to work, and everybody else on the team, how the team should work, so you don't get caught down the road worried about a culture that you hadn't maybe predicted and isn't working well. So just to talk about data management in the context of a team, and walk through a little bit of the details that we have found useful at Alaska EPSCoR. Developing a shared mental model of the data management plan can really, doing that at the beginning of the project can really save a lot of time later on. And this can really be a great team building exercise. So when you're writing the proposal and thinking about a data plan and mapping it to successive, strategic plans or annual reports, thinking about the whole process of a project and how your data is going to flow within that project can be really useful at the beginning. So you can develop strategies and documents to help guide your flow of data, and it can be project data that maybe you put in a strategic plan or annual report, or it can be data that you're collecting as you're doing your science. So some of the elements of a data management policy that we have found helpful are listed here. And each of these needs to be kind of considered within the time frame appropriate to the program. So the scope and the ownership, obligations, how, the planning for the data, where is it going to be stored? How is it going to be described? Who's going to be describing it? How is it going to be distributed and archived and registered? These are all really important ideas. And we have people at the University of Alaska Fairbanks who are doing a really good job putting together these plans to help teams at the beginning prepare for these large team projects where there's a lot of interdependencies and a lot of data being developed. So these topics are important to consider. More and more, we're seeing consortium models helping to support large projects such as One Health, where there's a prolific and distributed team. So this idea of lateral arrangements where stakeholders can come together and talk about how they want to grapple with data, that can really be an exercise to provide public goods and provide access to anyone. And this agreement can be used to share information and standards and open research and development and infrastructure. And we see the shifts and advances that sharing data has helped propel through the pandemic, where people all across the world were sharing information and data about COVID and how to address some of the impacts. I just also wanted to touch on the CARE principles. These are concerned with Indigenous community rights to engage in decision-making around data, and they include principles that data be managed to support collective benefit in terms of being inclusive for development and innovation, and providing equitable outcomes, that Indigenous data are grounded in community values which extend to society at large. And the value created from Indigenous data should benefit Indigenous communities in an equitable manner and contribute to Indigenous aspirations for well-beings. There are also elements of the authority to control, recognizing rights and interests, and data for governance. The responsibility for positive relationships, for expanding capability and capacity, and then the ethics for minimizing harm and maximizing benefit, for justice and for future use. So I think that the One Health program and people involved in One Health should be really paying attention to the CARE principles and learning. If you're not familiar with them, that's a great place. This website here is a really important source of information for the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And I'll just end with this quote that cooperative work is a social art and has to be practiced with patience. And I think our teams at the University of Alaska Fairbanks that are doing One Health work are exceptional, and that they're ready to kind of take the step with the next forms of data management.
Hello, my name is Ellen Chenoweth, and I'm going to present to you today about the Rural Alaska students in One Health research program. And I really appreciate the invitation to speak at the One Health conference. Today I'll be discussing One Health research, but I'll be focusing on presenting a model for that research in an educational framework for high school students in Southeast Alaska. And I'm presenting today from Tlingit Ani, which means Tlingit land here in Sitka, but the work I'm presenting spans Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian land and the waters, where Indigenous people have been stewards of their resources from time immemorial, up to and including today, which is part of what will be evident in my talk. So here's a little overview of what I'll be talking about. So I'll be describing the Rural Alaska Students in One Health research program, and I'll be really focusing on the different modes we used for community engagement, including how we've expanded that and changed our community engagement throughout the first 2 years of the program. And then I'll also talk a little bit about our evolving philosophy for engaging students. So you probably already have a little bit of a sense of what Razor's trying to do, but here's a formal description. We are a National Institutes of Health funded educational opportunity for rural high school students in Southeast Alaska. Our students conduct environmental research projects with mentors in their community while earning college credit and learning skills for college success. We're able to support these students with community-based projects because of a partnership between Razor and the CEDAR network, which monitors algal blooms and shellfish toxins in most communities around Southeast Alaska. This allows our program to not only include, but also focus on some of the smaller communities. This local focus demonstrates to students the usefulness of science in their communities, and the network provides trained mentors for students with local knowledge necessary for successful study designs that are going to be locally relevant projects. We feel very fortunate that this network was developed prior to the Razors program, and many of these researchers were already engaging with students in their communities, typically in a less formal or less intensive capacity than through the Razor program. I can't emphasize enough how partnering with this pre-existing network has really been the most important thing that we got right when designing the Razor program. We don't have to worry about whether our work is relevant to communities because the work is something that communities are already invested in. So here's some pictures of our students collecting data for their projects. No matter how much time I put into making my asynchronous recorded lectures just really pop, The students will tell you that their favorite part of the program usually involves crawling around on the beaches with their mentors or looking at beautiful phytoplankton under the microscope. Our student projects focus on research questions related to shellfish toxins in their environment. I learned at the last One Health conference, actually, that these poisonings from shellfish toxins, including paralytic shellfish poisoning, is at the top of the list for zoonotic disease concerns here in Alaska. By helping to monitor the water for harmful algal blooms that produce toxins and monitoring shellfish for accumulated toxin loads, our students help prevent poisonings in their community and support confidence in subsistence resources and tribal resource stewardship. Our goal for students in the RAISER program is that during the program, they understand and live what it means to be a scientist. We also want them to understand why research is important to them and their communities, and also to develop the confidence that they can succeed in college science if that's what they choose to do. So in addition to the research that students do in the field with their mentors, they also take an online course, and I'm the instructor of that course. And so this is sort of our visual syllabus for the class, and you can see the goals for the class as well as the course topics along the right side. I'll explain next, or a little bit later, how each of the different credit tracks kind of fits into our philosophy. But it's something that we developed in the second year of our program. So our students' main products of this program are a research poster that they present over Zoom, and also communication projects that they present to their communities. And these are typically a little bit more creative. This is an example of one of the research posters that our students produced during the first year. These are students from Wrangell, Alaska. And then these are students from Sitka, Alaska. And I believe this poster you can actually see presented at the One Health conference during one of the poster sessions. So in our first year, we assumed that our research mentors would be our main community partners to inform our students' projects and make sure that they're locally relevant and practicable. We also planned for students to complete research complete these community presentations, but those sort of creative science communication projects in an accessible format, and that would be one of the main ways that we give back to the communities. And also, of course, we plan for leadership to travel to these communities and meet people and get to know them on the ground. So, of course, travel was a little bit trickier this year. We weren't able to get to the communities the way we were in the first year, but we came up with a few new ways to reach out to these communities. And one of them actually came out of our experience with the pandemic, which was our students ended up giving their final presentations on Zoom, and we found that the communities and the high school teachers, principals, family members, friends were all interested to tune into those presentations. And so in addition to the more informal science communication presentation projects that they did, the research presentations also had significant community engagement. In the second year, we also made a greater investment in our CEDAR partnership, and so we focused more of our grant funds on strengthening that relationship. And we had always, we'd also planned, like I said, on our research mentors being our main community contacts. And while they are absolutely critical to our RAISER program, we realized that we wanted more than one point of contact in each community. And so right now we're in the middle of recruiting for an advisory council that we're hoping can kind of serve as another point of contact in these communities, specifically people who have spent longer periods of time getting to know these areas. And finally, another important piece of our community partnerships is community surveys. And so in addition to that sort of deep relationship that we have with our mentors and advisory council members, getting feedback from them, We also wanted to get some broad feedback from the community as a whole. And so this is an example of a question that we asked in our community surveys, and I believe there was about 157 respondents in 2 different communities so far that have been surveyed. And so this question asks, what are some reasons that you students should not study science? And I thought this was a little bit of an interesting question. And what we see is that there's large support for students studying science, that most people think that they in fact should study science. But there's also some concern that people who study science often do not return to these rural communities. And so that really reinforced to us the importance of the fact that RAISER is a program that takes place in these students' communities. It doesn't involve bringing the students to a summer camp or anything like that. And we hope that it'll reinforce the idea that science can benefit rural communities as well. So we also found evidence that the One Health concept resonated with both community members as well as RAISER participants before and after the program. The interconnectedness between human, animal, and environmental research was recognized and valued in these communities. As I originally envisioned the class, the RAISER program would be sort of this bar for what students should be able to do to set them up for college level achievement. And so this really discusses this section. I want to talk a little bit about how that philosophy has changed. So initially we thought we would recruit students who could succeed and help them over this bar, and then that would help move them into BLAST or other undergraduate research opportunities in or college studying in disciplines or other disciplines or community-based research. So in the first year, we found that many of our students were able to kind of clear the RAISER bar that we had set for them. But we also had other students who we felt had meaningful milestones and yet weren't able to finish the program for a variety of reasons. And we also realized that there were students left off on the sidelines without RAISER offerings. So specifically, these were students who were freshmen or sophomores or juniors or seniors that were just too busy to do RAISER, or that had kind of moved beyond RAISER and were already taking GER credit courses. So we really changed our philosophy into more of a stair step. So students can place themselves along these options at the point in their high school year or high school career that makes sense for them or that they have the time for. So they can just take the WhaleFest class if they want, which is our fall class. It's a 1-credit class. And then we have 1, 2, or 3 credit classes available in the spring. And next year, I'd like to also offer an additional class, a Bio 102 class, so that we can continue to work with RAISER students as they move on into their second year. So we've just finished our first year, and we have our second group of students that are getting ready to finish in the next few weeks. But just some very preliminary results from that first cohort of students. We have 4 former students who started college classes. 2 grads are actively involved in college or community research. And then 5 of our seniors are applying for college or scholarships this year. And 3 high school students joined our WhaleFest course again in last fall. So, you know, we're really excited to see how these students progress and to stay involved and support them in any way that we're able to, and to continue learning from their experiences. I just want to end with a final thought from Jan Straley, who is the PI on this project. She says, I do think and believe that the key to this success is listening to the students, their needs, and their passions. The success is not about a boat trip or other tangible benefits, but in the way that students are given a chance to be heard. We also learn from our mistakes, and we need to embrace that. We learn from intuition and not just from educational theory and pedagogy or objective measurements. And I think with this program, we're constantly trying to readjust the program, constantly trying to be really bold and agile, maybe even overcorrecting at times, just based on what we hear back from our students. And but at the same time trying to gather these objective measures that will ultimately help us make sense of the program and learn what we can from it to help make future initiatives of this type even more successful. So if you want more information about our program, just visit our website. Here you can watch our students present their research in our meeting archives, view their posters in more detail, or apply to be a student in Razor or a rural advisor. And our students will be presenting this year on April 21st at 1 p.m. And so that will be open to the public as well. So you're welcome to tune in and see what this year's Razor students have discovered through their research. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Amy Lauren Lovecraft, and welcome to the Saturday keynote. I'm going to be talking to you about Arctic futures and the use of scenarios as a methodology to help us understand better the complex dynamic between humans, animals, and the environment. I'm a professor of political science at UAF, and I'm also the director for the Center for Arctic Policy Studies, which resides in the International Arctic Research Center, IARC. So what is the future? It's not this moment, but it's the one that hasn't come yet. Why do we want to go there? Because if we can play with different elements of the future in ways that help us to understand what is plausible, as well as what is highly unlikely or implausible about the future, we can plan better to have the kinds of future or futures, right, that we would like to have. We know a great deal about future studies, but if we think about something like solving a problem in Arctic Alaska, perhaps something like what we've researched, community health and sustainability, we know that the knowledge is going to be scattered across multiple domains. There's going to be economic, social, clearly there will be indigenous knowledge, and a variety of other different methods and approaches. So scenarios are very good at putting disparate and often conflicting types of information together to help us understand better how to structure a problem and reach for a solution. And how do we get there? Well, come with me. So humans struggle to conceive of the future outside of a linear approach. This often happens because we're told we knew you would grow up that way, or the United States government is what it is because of the founders. But when we reflect on our lives or on histories we've been taught, we recognize that there's a lot of contestation and struggle, or even potentially we can remember where things could have gone in a different direction. And so this is important for us to recognize with thinking about our future that we'll share together. So one way that I found is successful to think about the future is to imagine it as though you are standing in front of a room of doors. And the room represents the time and the place. So let's say we go to Fairbanks in 2050, but we don't know what it looks like. We have to pick a door. So will what's behind the first door be the same as the others? No. One could imagine a future where Fairbanks shifts to renewables. One could imagine a future where Fairbanks grows massively because of a new gas pipeline coming down from the North Slope. One could imagine a future very similar to today or under a radical authoritarian government. But the point is the social and environmental variables that are going to be present in Fairbanks in 2050 or 2100 are ones we don't know yet. We have to imagine them. So when we make predictions about what might come to pass, we're not really talking about the future. We're talking about an idea of the future. And this can often reflect our hopes, right? Our desires for the future, as well as the fears we may have. And we want to try to avoid this. This set of images is one in the lower right quadrant, which starts showing you how you can think about this door exercise, right? We're in the now, and there's many possibilities for 2050. If we go counterclockwise, then we have an image from an amazing project led by Dr. Doug Cost, who's in the School of Education, and myself, where we worked with 21 Indigenous high school students coming from all over the Northwest Arctic Borough. This happened to be imagery of what they thought right, would be a positive future from the work that they did. You see human and animals, both in the environment, people with jobs. If you continue counterclockwise, this could be thought of as a negative image of the environment. I have no attribution for this, but clearly the bear is bearing a human industry on its back. And down in the lower left quadrant, we have some future research. In other words, this was created by a former PhD student, Kevin Hilmer-Pegram, and it shows you what Alaska would look like if all the existing planned and proposed infrastructure supporting oil and gas activities and commercial transport came to pass. So we know, right, then that we have to think about the future carefully and not get locked into, and here's the final potential problem, a narrative that seems to describe how things function, but is really a product of the media. And Heather points this out in a 2018 article where she lists all of these elements that seem to happen in every single Arctic story. What will happen with the Arctic? You find out by taking a brutal winter trip to a place where indigenous people live, and then you relate your information back to the great power struggle or the race to resources. So it's not as though these short-term narratives or the publication clearly of how people think about the Arctic is bad. It simply means that those narratives, while they can teach us things, are not the same as telling us what's going to happen in the future. So moving forward now, this is an example of how many of you might have experienced the products of a scenario activity, where you have on the y-axis, which is up and down, vertical, one key variable. Right here, it's going to be global energy demand, and one on the horizontal or the x-axis, right, the institutions and government, whether or not will be collaborative or competitive. This gives you 4 quadrants and allows you to compare and contrast aspects of those different possible future outcomes. This is from the Adaptations for a Changing Arctic report for the Bering, Beaufort, and Chukchi region. I'll show you another example of that later because it has an excellent chapter written by myself and Ben, I'll get his name by the end. I don't want to stop. Okay. So here's our differences between scenarios, forecasts, and visions, right? Scenarios ask what would happen if, and helps us in particular to manage things like risk and uncertainty. Forecasts are predictive, and visions are the desires. So scenarios aren't necessarily any better than these other versions of thinking about the future, but they are better for us to think through multiple possible futures and how we might shape them. So why do we do this? We do this because under conditions of uncertainty, we need nimble and strategic thinking that does not lock us into only one research track, one view of the Arctic, or one goal. We need to be able to think about the future carefully, but also thoroughly. And then the answer, of course, we want to give our children and others is that we prepared to respond to the circumstances. And I use this often as a question. How are we preparing to respond to the circumstances the future will give us? Vulnerability, risk, and resilience are 3 key components that we hear a lot in the academy and have a lot about Alaska and what's going to happen in its future as well as the rest of the Arctic. So scenarios can help decision makers related to this because scenarios can demonstrate what uncertainties are there and where we have good predictive capacity. They can also help us think through diverse and competing interests who may crowd a space and want different things from it. For example, the Arctic Ocean or the northern shores of Alaska, the state of Alaska. We can help put together knowledge and information from qualitative and quantitative places, from industry, private individuals, the university, and from Western and Indigenous knowledges. Scenarios do not require a PhD. They simply require someone to have expertise. And lastly, scenarios are very useful in sorting out what ifs when we're talking about planning that might surpass the capacity for current modeling. There's different kinds of scenarios. I'm going to focus in my limited time today simply on pointing out that scenarios enable communities to manage risk. And the best kinds of scenarios usually for this risk management at the community level is going to be an exploratory bottom-up scenario. For example, what is required for healthy, sustainable communities by 2050 in Arctic Alaska? Asking that question helps you begin to make lists of the key factors that matter to that healthy, sustainable community of the future, as well as thinking through the trajectories of those. So some of the examples that were created in the Northern Alaska Scenarios Project that were listed on what key factors matter most to community health and sustainability were language proficiency, transmission of indigenous knowledge, energy, right? Energy enough for a community to function, education that was accessible and high quality. These would be examples of drivers, right, related to what matters to people in that scenario. And then we can start to look at the trajectories or the possible futures of those drivers and think about whether or not they can coexist. So this process enables proactive adaptation. In other words, it lets communities or organizations, businesses, governments, right, work to understand their core values, what they want to take into the future, and think about how they can resist external forces or be better prepared for uncertain circumstances that would prevent them from reaching their goals. It enhances, as Al writes here, negotiable fate control. And when people have a sense of fate control, they are, in fact, better able to shape the circumstances around them. So scale matters very much. This is the focal question we used working with residents from Arctic Alaska in our particular project. And clearly, we had to have some global scale information related to climatic change. But mostly we were asking about the communities themselves and the people living in them, what they would need to sustain a healthy and sustainable community. So we want to make sure that scale matches the kinds of problems that we want to structure in order to plan for them and their resolution in the future. So this can also be a significant boon to science and science policy, because scenarios' ability to integrate multiple sources of knowledge mean that we can have a diversity of knowledge that lets us potentially avoid unpleasant surprises. Black swans, right, which are very rare, but potentially catastrophic events that can shift a system, or wild cards, just thinking about surprises that make a difference in our lives, can be thought about more clearly if you have more people thinking about a system. And institutional design then can be grown to avoid those surprises that we think are potentially going to happen, but unlikely. And we can tailor planning, right, to specific communities' own needs. So when scenarios are focusing participants and researchers, focusing the people working within them on ways to develop, maintain, or avoid an attribute of the future, we're going to have a great deal of discussion. And this is part of what is strong in the scenarios process. The ability to look at normative values as well as objective scientific facts to think about how you're going to create a future that is possible and plausible, and I would argue equitable. So in this sense, right, you can think of the metaphor as the bicycle, right? Arctic systems have a dynamic equilibrium. They're moving forward, but they're moving and changing. So the idea is that with enhanced knowledge and a better understanding of the future, we can keep our bicycle, our community, right, or our state upright as it goes over hills and in through valleys and on the winding trail. So in this sense, right, scenarios are windows onto multiple possible futures. And by looking through those windows, we can think about what we would like and what we wouldn't like to have in any particular future. So here's an example. I'm going to show you quickly slide 1 and slide 2 of scenarios that we ran with a group of Arctic experts, but not all of them were necessarily Arctic residents. So when you look inside, right, you can see that there are 6, right, different clusters of variables around Arctic policy, global trends, local trends, economics, science, right, and then an emission scenario. So by combining different possible emission scenarios with different possible Arctic policy outcomes, global trends. You can imagine yourself here going clockwise. You get one vision of what the world might look like in 2050. So this would be one possibility behind what is the Arctic doing in 2050 door. An emissions reduced area, right? But with the insecure world and the Arctic depopulating. We can mix those variables up and think of another plausible future, right? Where you might have an insecure Arctic, a warmer world, but with high resource demand, right? So here your emission scenario is 8.5, and continuing to go around clockwise, we have different kinds of trends that are occurring. So both of these scenarios have multiple variables drawn from multiple sources of knowledge, both Western science and indigenous, and they relate to us in ways that help us think through how we might want to plan for either of these futures. There were 7 total developed from this research project. Lastly, I'd like to point you to the adaptations actions, for a changing Arctic, the AACA project. In this report, in this project, there are 3 different research areas, and ours that includes Alaska is the Bering, Chukchi, Beaufort, and we have an enormous amount of data here on adaptations actions that have occurred, as well as a full chapter tied specifically to scenarios. So I thank you very much for your time, and just remind you that when you think about the future, we have to also think about our past. On the one hand, maybe there's things to avoid. On the other hand, there are things to continue. And most importantly, right, we don't want to discount future possibilities simply because we've never seen them. This is the story of the Black Swan. The Black Swan was a joke, essentially, in Roman times, until people expanded their range far enough and were recording about species and found that, in fact, black swans do exist. So without being too much of a Rumsfeld, make sure that you think through what you know and don't know, and think through what it might be that exists that you think is not actually a possibility for the future. Thank you very much.